You're listening to the Reds Podcast.
This is episode number 10. We're going to talk about being interviewed. What happens when somebody sticks a mic in your face? You don't want to sound like an idiot, do you? We're going to talk about that, how to prep for an interview, what to do when the host hits record, and how to follow up so the interview is very successful to help you promote your business. That's next on Red Podcast.
This is the Red Podcast. Real entrepreneur development. Make more money, work less, and live a life of freedom. No BS advice that really works. Here's your hosts, David Hooper and Laurel Staples.
Laurel.
Hey, David.
We're back.
We are back. How's it going?
Another episode. It's going great. And speaking of being back, we just got back from PodCamp in Nashville.
Ooh, I liked PodCamp this year.
You've been a few years, right?
This is my third year. You introduced me to it.
Yeah, so you gave a presentation last year. This year, I gave a presentation. And explain what it is. Do you know how to explain it?
I can figure it out here. PodCamp, from my understanding, it's an unconference. But the topic is about content producers, so podcasters, bloggers, people who are producing content.
Content creators,
if you will.
Yeah. So it's kind of a get-together. There are people that do present ideas. Some of them are organized. I'd like to think mine was organized. Some of them disorganized. One girl was hungover or
Yeah,
drunk.
One girl I went to her session, she claimed to be hungover. I didn't just make that up. She was apologizing that she had done her PowerPoint presentation half drunk in the middle of the night, and her voice was all raspy because she had been up all night, and she thought it was funny. The rest of us didn't find it amusing.
So it's kind of hit or miss. There's some really talented people at PodCamp, and everything is random. The presentations are random, which I never really understood, but that's like their version of democracy.
And they have impromptu sessions.
Yeah.
So if any session you want to give during the impromptu time, you just sign up on the board and you can give a talk.
Yeah. So it's kind of a think tank for podcasters, bloggers, and other things. But a lot of this was on podcasting, and one of the things that happened while we were there is they wanted to interview Laurel, and she refused. So then
they wanted to interview Laurel.
Then they came to me, and I said, "Why the hell not?" So it got us thinking about what we can talk about as far as this podcast, and one of those things is how to give a good interview.
Well, and they had the coordinators of PodCamp had a little booth that they were taking different people from the unconference in and interviewing them. I didn't do it, so I didn't know what they were interviewing you about, but I assume it was about what you do. And
I don't even know.
Okay. And then they had a speaker outside so that people could hear what was going on.
It was actually a little bit unorganized. It was almost like I used to, I worked for, but I also worked next to a modeling agency. And you would see like casting calls of men and women sometimes, and they would just sit you on like a couch, and they'd say, "All right, this one is for Trident Gum, and we need you to kiss and act like you like each other." And that's kind of what this interview was like. I was in a room with somebody who didn't know me, and I didn't know him. We didn't know anything about each other. I didn't know what the interview was actually for, and he didn't know me from anybody else. So you were kind of trying to feel each other out. And that's what we want to talk about today, is kind of getting to know people a little bit, getting to know who you're going to interview, and also getting to know who's interviewing you. That's the right way to say it, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And your thing was definitely impromptu, but most of the time when you do an interview on somebody else's radio show or podcast or even TV, you have a little bit of time to prepare. And I think today we're going to talk about not those impromptu times necessarily, but you can use it for that. But
yeah, what happens when somebody asks you to do an interview? What do you need to do to make sure it's successful and you don't sound like an idiot?
Exactly. Well, I think so many business owners have found that it's a great way to promote their business through doing interviews. Again, TV, radio, podcasts. There's so many podcasts these days. But most people really don't know the first thing about giving a successful interview. And by successful interview, I mean one where you seem professional, you seem knowledgeable, you come across as the person that the listeners trust enough to hopefully give you their business, spend money with you. That's how you really want to come across. Otherwise, honestly, you can do interviews until you're blue in the face, but it's not going to affect your business in any sort of positive way. It's just a waste of your time.
I think that's my number one advice for somebody who wants to have a successful interview is that you need to go in there with purpose. And a great way to see this in action is if there's a new movie out or a very popular author has a book out, when you watch the late night television shows, when you watch news shows, you'll see them basically plugging their book or plugging their movie. Hey, I'm in this new movie. It stars this guy. Here's a clip. The movie opens Friday. They're talking about the movie. And with your interview, you want to do something similar with your book, with your podcast, with your business. But at the same time, it's not solid promotion.
Exactly. And another thing that you might have a purpose for, and this has really played a role for me in my business, is practice.
Just getting better at interviews, you mean?
Getting better at interviews, at being interviewed, because I do a lot of interviews on my show, which I know we're going to talk about that aspect of it in our next episode, but being interviewed. So when people ask me to be on their show these days, I usually say yes, because I want the practice of getting better, because it's just something that once you do over and over again, you get better at it. So that can be your purpose as well.
And that's why I did this thing at PodCamp, because I said, what the hell? Just being thrown into a room with a guy that I don't know and I've got no idea what he's going to ask me. That gets you really good on your feet. Or you fail. Either way.
Or you totally fail.
Either
but
way,
you get
but
the practice.
Yeah.
You get the practice that you need to do the next one. And
but
that kind of... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if you know who you're dealing with, it is a good idea to research that person to kind of get an idea for what kind of questions he's going to ask. Certainly, if it's a podcast on, let's say, financial independence, you know that you're going to get some financial questions. If it's a podcast like we do, which is like a marketing podcast, we would ask you marketing questions. Yeah.
And I think for me, you get really embarrassed if you don't research the host and listen to the show that they're already doing or watch the television show that they're doing. I've gotten caught up before where I go on somebody's show and I didn't do that step. And then they say something and they catch you off guard, and it was right there on their about page.
Yeah. Well, with that said, I think this is maybe obvious, but you need to know who you're talking to. You need to get the host's name correct. This happens a lot actually in my business, where we're doing a lot of stuff to go out and promote either a record album or a book or whatever we're promoting, where you'll do a lot of it's via something they call ISDN. It's not unlike Skype, but you could do 50 radio interviews per day. And you really need to get the host's name correct. You need to know where that host is. You don't want to say New York when it's Boston or vice versa. But the same thing can happen even just like with a one-off interview. I always write the host name down on a Post-it note, put it right in front of the mic so I can't mess it up.
I think that's a great idea. And it's awkward for the show host as well. I've had some people on my Go Fire Yourself podcast who have said my name is Lauren or Laura, and I have to stop them and say, sorry, it's Laurel, just so they can get it right going forward. And it just makes everybody feel a little bit awkward. So if you go ahead and just do that research and know how to say it, and if you don't know how to say it, just ask them, how do you say it? I mean, that's pretty easy.
I think checking in with the host or whoever's doing the booking to find out if there's anything that you need to do in advance, anything you need to have prepped. I know on my radio show, on Music Business Radio, one of the things that we like people to do when they come in is we like them to have music that we can play, sometimes what we call work tapes, like the demos that became the recorded song that everybody knows. Sometimes we like them to bring in a guitar or an instrument. So I think you can do whatever the equivalent of that is. Like, hey, do you want me to bring in the book so I can read from it? Do you want me to bring in anything specific, or is it just going to be just me and my voice? Find out what it is that they want you to do that's going to make a good show. Because really, the good show, yeah, you're part of it and you can make judgment on it, but it really is up to them.
And on top of that, I think, again, I just want to say, listen to the shows that they've already produced, because even I've had instances where I'm getting better at this all the time, but where I've contacted the host and I've said, hey, is there anything I need to prepare in advance? Any specific questions you want me to talk about? And they said, no big deal. And then at the end of the show, which I'd never gotten to the end of their podcast, they had a lightning round that they did on every podcast. And I hadn't gotten that far in listening to the beginning and middle of their shows.
Yeah.
And they didn't tell me about it in the email. And I should have been prepared for that one. So do due diligence there. Do both.
Some things you can prep for in advance, and it sounds really good because not all the listeners know that it's being prepped for in advance. Mm-hmm. So it's going to make you sound really good as a speaker when you get up there and you've kind of got the hint ahead of time of what you're going to talk about. And speaking of what you're going to talk about, Laurel, you do a lot more interviews than I do as far as outside of the studio, a lot of stuff via Skype. How often do you find that the people that you're talking to, they've got like dogs barking, or they're in a car and they're like ordering food, or there's the drive-through window, Does that happen a lot with you?
Way too often. I've had some crazy stuff. One of the people on my podcast, we tried to do this we had our set date, and I was like, I heard some stuff in the background when we were on Skype, and I was like, where are you? She's like, oh, I'm in the back of Kinko's sitting on the floor in this hallway. And I was like, well, I hear some people. And she's like, oh, they're going away. And then people started coming back and forth, and we had to reschedule.
That's not really respectful to the host. It makes you look like an amateur. And it's so easy to fix. If you've got kids, get the kids out of the house, close the door, tell them not to bother you. If you've got a dog, kennel it, let it out, do something. But you don't want somebody like knocking on the door. It's kind of like the equivalent. One time, this is kind of embarrassing, Laurel. One time, so I was in junior high, and I didn't really have like an enemy, but I was always one of those guys, and I went on later to do it professionally, but I was always one of those guys that would prank call people. And I'm prank calling this guy from class and just kind of playing a joke on him, and my mom picked up.
Oh.
Yeah, it was a little embarrassing. Then the jig is up, right? Knows who you are. That's kind of the equivalent of like a kid knocking on your door and saying, "Daddy, can I do this?" And no, that doesn't make you look very professional at all. And you can write it off and say, oh, family first, and I love to work at home. And there's this big thing about transparency. But at the same time, just here's another one. I was in the studio about 2 weeks ago, and water bottle noises, man. Had the water bottle, one of those crackling
like
water
the plastic
bottles.
water bottles.
Oh, my gosh,
yeah.
Right up next to the mic. And she's like, well, it's going to make it sound more authentic. Well, yeah, it does that, but it also makes you sound amateur when these mics are picking up everything, because this was in a studio and really good mics and in a quiet environment. It makes it sound bad. And
just practice doing what you would do if this is like a really big deal. If a huge television station, ABC, Good Morning America, calls you and says, hey, we want to do an interview, you wouldn't have that crackly water bottle. You wouldn't be sitting in the floor of Kinko's. You need to treat your host. If you agree to do a show with them, you need to treat them like they are the professional that they are, and you need to have that respect for them. And I think a lot of people don't think like that. Like, oh, when I hit the big time, then I'll act professional. But start practicing that right now. And
here's another thing. Verify time zones and show up on time. I am blown away. And this goes for if you're doing an interview or if you're being interviewed. But I'm blown away by the guys like, hey, hang on, David. I got to finish my breakfast. It's like, what? I just got to finish this piece of toast. It's like, no. And then, and they're 5 or 10 minutes late, or they're not ready. I've literally had live conference calls. This is when it gets bad, when you're doing something live, where I've got 100, 200 people waiting on the conference call, and the guy doesn't understand what it is that we're doing. And that could be my fault for not letting him know that this thing is live. I feel like I let him know that, but he didn't get it. And that's where all this prep comes in. You're going to look like an idiot when you step in late on a live thing, certainly. And if it's not live, you're making your host wait. If it's in a real studio, that stuff is costing time. So I think you need to be prepared, show up early, make sure the connections and the equipment are working, and make